There once was a man who had two sons. One day, his younger son came up to him and said, "Father, may I have my inheritance?" Which this is a really unheard of thing to do. The boy's roughly around 16, 17 years old, and he asked his dad for his set aside money for that one day when he'd inherit it. It's crazy. I know what my dad would do had I asked him that, and I think many of you know what he would do if I asked him for my inheritance, if I had one. But he asks him for his inheritance, and the father gives it to him. And he knows that giving it to him is not the best thing to do for the boy. For if this boy has this massive wealth, he's going to squander it and he's going to lead to his own self-destruction. But the father gives him the choice to have this inheritance. He doesn't control him or rebuke him or hit him or tell him to go to his room. He gives him the inheritance. Not long after that, the boy decides to leave, for he'd been drifting away from the family for some time. He'd been looking at the outside world and saw it through the eyes of wonder and adventure, and he wanted to go experience things, see what there was that the world could offer him, and he felt confined at home, restricted, enabled, not allowed to live his life. He believed that the essence of life was to get away from his father. So he took his 2/9 of the inheritance, which was what the younger son would get in those times, and he set off to a distant land. He got the servants together that he was going to take with him on the journey, the wagons full of clothes and jewelry and the property that he could liquidate into cash, and he set off to a distant land. As he's in this distant land, he goes from town to town and he starts to acquire these friends who are attaching themselves to him because he's the most popular guy. He's buying people drinks, he's having a good time, he's indulgent, and he is fun, and he's loving life. He's learning other languages, other cultures. He's wearing exotic new clothing. He has exotic new jewelry. He is living life, and it's fun. Meanwhile, the father sits at home and he's noticeably grieved. He still goes about his day and his business, and he does it with integrity and honor, and he loves his other son really well, and he's good to his servants, and he's good to his people and his family. But he has a hole in his life, and that is that his son is lost. Every day, around the same time, when the sun is setting, he sits and he waits. The father waits day after day while the older brother works, his head down, upset that his brother had basically stolen part of the family's wealth that they were supposed to inherit together and run the family business. He's upset, but he works, and the father waits. The young son who's living life has been living very loosely, and he's not investing, and he's not being a good steward with his money like most 17-year-olds, I can imagine, and 27-year-olds, and fill in the blank. But he's living loosely, and it's been some time, maybe even a couple of years, 3-4 years have gone by, and this inheritance was vast. It was big, and he's about to buy rounds for his buddies who are sitting at the table, and the person running the bar goes up to him and says, "Hey, man, we're going to have to ask you to leave." He says, "What? What are you talking about? I've been ordering drinks here for 6 months. What do you mean you're going to have to ask me to leave?" "Well, you haven't been paying us, and so we can't give you any more things without you paying us. In fact, you owe us quite a bit of money, and we're thinking about having you killed. So you might want to go." So he does. And he goes back to his place that he's staying, and his stuff's all out on the street, and there's some peasants rummaging through his belongings, and he shoos them away, and he looks around, and he's going to call on his servants to help figure out the situation, but they're gone. And one of them left a note saying, "Hey, I went to go work for somebody who's going to pay me. Have a nice life." And he has nothing. So he starts to sell off his possessions because he has to have just enough money to eat, to scrape by, to have food and water. And he sells his robes and his shoes and his jewelry. And a famine comes in, and this boy has nothing. He has absolutely nothing. He starts asking for a job, which is unheard of for a man of his status, that he came from this family, to start asking for the charity of others to work on their farms. And nobody was hiring, except for one person, a pig farmer. They said, you can go find work with the pig farmer. For him to go work at this pig farm was for him to give up everything. He had already given up his family. He'd lost his fortune and his identity as a nobleman. And now he has to give up his religion because he's a Jewish man, and to touch a pig is to make him unclean. And to habitually touch pigs as his livelihood was to make him unable to worship Yahweh. Therefore, his religion was gone, his identity was gone, and all of the things he was putting into his life to fill this hole, this essence of life apart from the Father, was no more, and he was a pig farmer. Meanwhile, his father waited, and he waited. And his brother worked, and he worked. He's up to his shins and knees in manure and mud. And he's really hungry. His clothes are just undergarments now, and there's holes in them. And through one of the holes, you can see some ribs piercing the skin. And his once round, well-fed face is sunken in and encaved. And his once long and curly hair has been cut off with a knife because it was dreadlocked and infested with insects. He has scabs on his body and bangs and bruises all over his legs from the pigs running into him, and he is starving to death, making it day by day. And this life of abundance away from the Father has all of a sudden became a life on the edge of life and death. And he's depraved, and he's sick. He starts to notice that this pig food in these pods looks like something, some sustenance, something to get him fed or to the next day. And he's just managing to get by with another thing to put into his life. And he gets on his knees amongst these unclean swine. The Hebrew word for him is other, those other things. They won't even say their names. And he's there and he eats. And at that moment, he comes to his senses. He has an awakening, an epiphany, and he thinks, the servants at my father's land are treated better than I am right now. They at least get to eat. I've got to go home to my father. It's like an awakening happens, a spiritual rejuvenation, and he's suddenly aware of his situation, and he knows essence of life isn't away from his father, but life comes when he goes back to his father. And his father waits, and he waits, and he waits. And his brother works, and he works, and he works. The long journey home, the boy has a lot of time to think. And he rehearses every scenario in his head. What is my dad gonna do when I get home? When he finds out I squandered 2 nights of his huge accumulation of wealth, what is he gonna do when he sees how terrible I look and how I've dishonored the family? I'm gonna tell him, I'm not worthy to be your son anymore. I get that. But at least let me be a slave so that I can eat something, because I'm about to die. I'm sorry. I will do this, 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 and this. And he's playing in his head how his dad's going to come out, and maybe his dad's going to hit him in the face. Maybe he's going to cast him out. Maybe he's going to have him killed. And he plays these scenarios, and his stomach turns and knots up with anxiousness and nervousness as he plays, and he's guilty. And he's sick. Meanwhile, the father waits. And the brother works. And the father waits. One night, as the father routinely sits and waits for his son, he sees a speck. And the speck is in the distance. It's in the horizon. And as only a father's intuition knows, he knows that this is his son. So he takes his robe and he tucks it in his belt, and he begins on a dead, full-blown sprint. My dad told me when I was in college, we were at a football game, and there's a trainer. He was in his 40s, and he was an overweight guy, and he took off sprinting to get a golf cart for an injured player, and it looked hilarious how this guy was running. He was running way too fast. And my dad told me that day, he said, men aren't supposed to sprint in public, unless they're an athlete or something. And that sat with me, that stayed with me, because what it does is when a grown man is sprinting in public, it says some things, whether you know it or not. says that this man is not prepared. He's in a state of an emergency. He might not have his stuff together. He's got to scramble and scurry, and he doesn't have anybody else to do it, so he has to run and do it. And in this time, it was especially true. Men did not sprint in public, especially a dignitary. This man, this wealthy man, this noble man, he sprints, and I bet you it looked hilarious. This man kicking up dust, knees awkwardly buckled in, maybe a little bit of a belly because they have money, so they're probably more well-fed than other people, and he's sprinting as fast as he can. It says it's a long way off. This man probably hasn't sprinted in 35 years since he was a boy, 40, 50 years, who knows, and he takes off sprinting a long ways off. Who knows what the younger son was thinking as he sees his dad, his father, sprinting towards him. He must think he's about to spear him or punch him or something. Not what he does. As his father reaches him, he grabs his shoulders tightly, and the boy begins his rehearsed and well thought out plea. Father, I'm no longer worthy to be your son. And before he can say a word, the father holds him up from falling to his knees, and he yells to a servant, prepare a fattened calf, we're gonna celebrate. And he says to the boy, you are worthy to be my son. You were lost and now you're found, and we're gonna celebrate. He throws his robe over him, he puts his ring on his finger, and he gives him sandals, and he prepares a feast. This boy came back as an image of what sin is on the outward manifestation, for it corroded his inside, but it manifested itself on the outside. The boy's hair was gone. His cheeks were incaved. He was wearing slave's clothes, but the father put his robe on him, saying, you are righteous. He put his ring on him, saying, you have authority. He put his sandals on his feet and said, you are above a slave. You are in high standing. And he prepared a young calf, saying, you are the most important person in my life. They ate meat about once a week. It was normally lamb. So for them to have the beef, the calf, that was something that happened like on holidays and very special occasions. So this son was celebrated his arrival. The father looked at his son, and he gave him the love that he needed, not the love that he deserved. While the older son, who had been working, continued to work. He sees some festivities going on at the house, and he asks the servant, what's going on? He said, you haven't heard your brother's home. Isn't that cool? You know, they're killing a calf, having a barbecue. It's really fun. Friends are in town, family. And the older brother gets irate. He's upset. This punk kid, this stupid brother of mine who's taken our wealth, who's squandered it, had the audacity to come back here. He wanted to probably beat him for that. And he sits there, and he's outside of the festivities, and the father, not unlike when he ran out to the younger son, runs out to the older brother and says, why aren't you coming in? The older brother looks at his dad and doesn't address him as father, and says, your son, doesn't address his brother as brother, has done all these things, and you're gonna throw a party when you haven't even slaughtered a goat for me and my friends to have a party, and I've been here day in and day out. I've been working, I've been doing the right things. I look good, I have the family's name intact, and you're gonna treat him like this? That's not fair, Dad. And the father ends it with just saying, please come inside, join the celebration. That's where Jesus leaves this story in Luke chapter 15 as he tells this parable. He leaves it right there with this open invitation to come inside to the older brother. And he does so, I think, intentionally, because that's a choice that I believe every single one of us in this room has today, to come inside and share the joy. Jesus tells this parable. It's one of three that he tells to the Pharisees, these religious leaders. They're upset at Jesus because he's hanging out with sinners and tax collectors. He's hanging out with people who commit debauchery in front of him. and they're upset with him. So he tells these stories about how those who are lost are the ones that need to be found. Those who need the most mercy will appreciate God's grace more than anybody else. And so we name this parable the story of the prodigal son, and we focus on the younger brother. And we hear these things, and it's a great story. That's a great subject to have, for it represents us all at some point. For we have at one time in our life, or maybe we're doing so right now, we believe that the essence of life is life apart from the Father, and we seek all of these things of this world to fill us up, and it might not even be bad things. It could be work things. It could be church things, and we fill ourselves up, and we fill ourselves up, and we exclude the Father. But then when we have that spiritual awakening, that coming to our senses, that rejuvenation of our spirit, and we realize, you know what? Life is with the Father. I need to be with him. That's when that good Father comes sprinting to us and receives us. And that's a great message. But I think it would be unfair to us all to say that's the message. And then you have another camp and people who say, you know what? Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, the religious leaders. The focus, the subject of this is the older brother. Maybe it should be called the parable of the older brother who did everything he was supposed to do. For this older brother worked and he did everything he was supposed to do. But when his brother who was lost and is now found came home, he was bitter and resentful, and he didn't want to join in on the celebration. Instead, he wanted to be mad. So you think, you know what? That's who Jesus was talking about. He's addressing the religious leaders. Yeah, he points to the disposition of all mankind through this younger brother and this beautiful symbol. This parable is so complex and so rich in content that we could preach week upon week on it. That's how beautiful Jesus' 2 paragraphs of storytelling is. So he points to the younger brother. This is the disposition of mankind. This is the older brother. This is what happens when you become rigid with religiosity and you look down at people and you don't join in the celebration when the people who are sick are healed or when the lost are found. But I think even that misses the point. The subject of this story, the key figure of this story, rest entirely and utterly on the good Father. For he's the common denominator. He has both sons, and he's the father to them both dispositions, both separateness, and he meets both of them where they are, and he gives them overwhelming compassion, and he wants to rejoice with them, and he pleads with them, and he loves them. The good Father is the subject of this parable. Now it's Father's Day, and we have incredible fathers all through the house. Tonight, all of us have had, we've been birthed into this world with a mother and father, and not everybody has had a good experience with their father. And that's very sad, and it's unfortunate, but we have in here the Heavenly Father who shows us love, who is so far above all that we could ever know, who gives us this love that we need, not that we deserve, and who pleads with us and wants us to be found and wants to rejoice with us. We have this Father. He's the subject. He is the foundation, and he is everything in this story. In his book, The Returning of the Prodigal Son, Henry Nouwen talks about this story in beautiful detail. I would encourage you to get on Amazon or go to a bookstore and buy this book, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And he talks about how he feels like he was the younger son, and I believe I'm the younger son. He also talks about how he's the older son, which I believe I'm the older son. And there's this mix that goes in with it. And he sees it, and he's thought for so long how the returning of this prodigal son, when he comes home and receives this grace, that is when the story ends. Hallelujah, you were lost and now you're saved. You were dead and now you're alive. But he started thinking as he was looking at this Rembrandt painting of the prodigal son, and as the father holds this son with his robe around him, he starts to picture himself not just as the prodigal son, but as the father also. The younger son had this plea to come back and become a slave and a servant, but had he done so, if the father would have granted him that, he could have just been an employee. He could have griped, he could have complained, and he could have left anytime he wanted. But for him to be reinstated into sonship meant this: he was ingrained into the inheritance of the father. Meaning, he needed to become like the father. He came for a meal, but the father gave him a celebration, and he invited him to meal after meal after meal, which is intimate, which is where you get to know one another. And so his father poured everything he had into this son, and as children, we're meant to grow up. I mean, I'm 12 years old and have 2 kids now. Who would have ever thought? I still look at myself as a child, but we grow up. And it's scary and it's fast, and there's so long we want to sing about. And it's beautiful being children of God, because we are. Thank you, Father, we're your children, but we're also called to share in the inheritance of the Father, to become like the Father. Whether you're the younger son, the older son, or somewhere in the middle son, you're called to be like the Father. So when we end the story at the boy's arrival, we end it with this version of this cheap grace where we say we're sorry, and then we go back out and do it again. We get hungry, we say we're sorry, and we go out and do it again. And Ewan says in his book, he says the key to being like the Father, the spiritual fatherhood of God, the key to that is to practice the radical discipline of staying home. Of staying home. The ball's in our court. We have a God that loves us so much that we do have a choice to take what is ours or what we believe is ours and go off. And he's not gonna hold us tight and say, no, you can't do that, because he knows we're gonna go off and destroy ourselves. But he loves us enough to let us do that. And then he loves us enough to bring us back and to meet us where we're at. He loves us enough to say, I forgive you, but here's this. Here's my robe, my righteousness. Here's my ring, my authority. Here's some sandals. You're standing in the kingdom. Here's this calf, the celebration, because you are important, and I want you to take over everything that I have. Come to the party. Let's be people who stay home. I'd love to give you a list or ABCs of how to be a good father this Father's Day, but I want to give you just one thing. Stay home with the Father and learn from him. Learn how to be like him. Let his love become your love so that your acts of love are genuine and not just works like the older brother. Spend time at the table with him. In doing so, you will inherit all that he has. And you will not be conformed to the ways of the world, but you'll be transformed by the renewal of your mind. That way you can test and you will know what is pleasing to God and what is his perfect will. God, we thank you that you're the good Father. God, we thank you that you've called us not just to be your sons, but to become like you, God. We thank you for your inheritance. We thank you for your calling and commission, God. We thank you that you sprint to us and you meet us where we're at. God, whether we're filling ourselves up with these things in life that are other than you, that the essence is away from you, God, I pray for those who are hearing your word, that they are strengthened and called and commissioned to stay home. God, thank you, for you are a good Father.